Seriously, what was the Hungarian Grand Prix? It was some sort of emotional roller coaster, and if you're a Ferrari fan, you probably hopped off that roller coaster in absolute agony. If you're looking for any sort of good news today, I have nothing for anyone. No, I'm just kidding. There's plenty of good news, except for Ferrari fans. My name is Blake, and welcome to Break F1. If you're looking for some data-driven, technical Formula 1 analysis from a former Formula 1 performance engineer, this might be your new channel. I spent 10 years in F1 as a trackside performance engineer and then later a simulator performance engineer. So hopefully I can share some of the things I've learned with you during my career with you. Also, if you enjoy this video, don't forget to do that thing. Now, as far as the weekend goes, what if I told you that I don't think Mercedes made a huge step this weekend? Would you believe me? Would you turn this video off? I mean, they've scored double podiums back to back and Russell was on pole position this weekend. That is definitely a positive sign. But there's a couple of other interesting stories to tell. A lot of people have asked me if Hamilton could have driven from P7 to P2, while Russell converted pole position to P3, surely Hamilton could have won this race. Now, I don't agree with that, and as always, I'm gonna explain why. McLaren looked like heroes all weekend up until Sunday. Norris qualified 4th and was regularly up at the top of the timesheets during practice, and then somehow on Sunday they just deflated. We'll have a little look at that as well. Now, the two biggest question marks I had over this weekend: how did Red Bull underperform all weekend and then come alive during the race? Verstappen had a disaster Q3 and started P10, while Perez didn't even make it out of Q2. Somehow they converted this disaster Saturday into a Verstappen win and a Perez P5. But honestly, I think that should have at least been a Perez P3. Now, it's time to break down the 2022 Hungarian Grand Prix. Now, since I didn't do any F1 watch-along streams over on Twitch this weekend, I'm going to quickly go through the qualifying pace analysis, but don't worry, we'll get straight to the race right after this. Now, I'm going to say the track conditions and qualifying definitely played a factor in terms of some of the randomness that we saw. We went from a 50-degree track in FP1 and FP2 to a wet track in P3, and then a very green and cold track in qualifying. Throughout the whole weekend, McLaren and Mercedes looked great, with Ferrari in the mix and the Red Bulls were on the struggle bus. Now, Perez gets knocked out in Q2, and he really just seemed a bit on the back foot all weekend in terms of single lap pace. Verstappen didn't do much better as he had a poor first run in Q3 and then some engine issues, which meant he qualifies P10. Honestly, qualifying 3 looked like a bit of a mess for a lot of people. Along with Verstappen, Alonso, Hamilton, and Ricciardo didn't improve in Q3. But George Russell takes his first pole position with a great lap, out-qualifying both of the Ferraris. Lewis also had some issues in his Q3 run, so he starts in P7. We've got a very mixed-up grid, so this is going to be very interesting. Now, at the beginning of this video, I told you I do not think Mercedes made a huge step forward this weekend, and let me explain why. This chart shows the gaps to pole position in the dry qualifying sessions since Spain. Don't get me wrong, Mercedes absolutely nailed this weekend, but considering that McLaren, Alfa, and Alpine all made similar improvements to Mercedes this weekend, it makes me just think that Ferrari and Red Bull struggled a bit. Mercedes' race pace is definitely in the mix again this weekend, so really they can race and compete for points. Now, despite what this graph makes me think, I still feel like we're going to see some more Mercedes featuring the front 2 rows of qualifying in the upcoming races, especially after the rules shake up after the break. Now, as far as the usual qualifying telemetry compares that I usually show you, there's not really that much exciting going on this weekend. There was a lot of messy laps in qualifying, but it's just difficult to pull too many meaningful trends and understand where certain cars were strong or weak. Now, I will say that Hungary is not particularly sensitive to engine power. We saw Red Bull adding quite a bit more downforce to their car, which removes some of their usual straight line speed advantage, and the McLaren actually looked very reasonable around a single lap, especially in the high speed corners, so maybe there's something good on the horizon for them. Now, as for the race, a lot like Saturday, the track was cold, the sky was dark, and it was on the edge of raining the entire race. Now, the race was mostly a 2-stop, with the Alpines and Bottas going for the 1-stop strategy. Spoiler alert, this was not the play. The starting grid was split between the soft and the medium tires, with most people having 1 new hard and at most 2 new mediums for the race. Now, the race is kind of split into 3 groups. You see the front runners here, Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull. The middle group you can see here, and then at the back of the pack was kind of the Williams and Tsunoda. So much for this Haas resurgence story arc, I guess. Now, just a quick reminder for anybody who's new to this kind of graphic, this is what I like to call the race trace or race gaps plot. This is really just a description of the relative time between drivers at the end of each lap. The race starts here on the left and finishes here on the right. When you see a driver drop backwards like this, this is indicative of a pit stop. You can also tell if a driver is pulling away or falling back towards another driver by their relative gaps. Now, as much as I'd like to cover the entire grid and all of the strategies, I'm just going to start with McLaren and move up the grid. I really don't have that many great things to say about McLaren's race. I mean, honestly, Norris qualified 4th to finish 7th, while Ricciardo qualified 9th to finish P15, and he wasn't helped by the 5-second penalty. Now, what did they do so poorly? Well, they had absolutely no race pace. Their fastest stints were a match on pace for the slowest stints of the top 3 teams. So they're completely in a different ballpark. Clearly, they got something right on Saturday and benefit from the Red Bulls out of place, but they had substantially worse performance in the race. My initial thoughts with McLaren are it was something to do with the track conditions, but McLaren were reasonable on Friday with the warm conditions, good in qualifying on the cold conditions, and then they just disappeared through the Grand Prix. I mean, coming back to our race trace, I'm really struggling to make any sense of it at all. Here they fit a hard tire at the end. Norris seems to go okay on it, but Daniel gets absolutely eaten alive at the end of the race on this hard tire. Honestly, I feel like this is kind of it for McLaren's season unless something changes massively. Realistically, for McLaren, on a good weekend, 4th fastest team is the best, and if they're not lucky, Alpine are going to take them in the Constructors' Championship. Now, as for this race analysis, I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. As the front of the race is the 3-team race that we've been waiting for, where all 6 of the drivers finish, I'm going to go through the race stint by stint to try and help understand what's going on. Now, after the race, Red Bull did confirm that their original plan was considering using the hard at the race start as they were out of position. But after the laps to the grid on the soft tire, the drivers were not happy with the grip on the softest tire. The track was cold and there was a lot of moisture in there. Now let's look at the first stint of the race. We've got Russell leading, and it looks like the Ferraris are catching him a little bit at the end of the stint. Realistically, he just doesn't have the pace. Now, if we take a step back, it looks to me like Sainz is holding up Leclerc a little bit. And you can see here, once Sainz pits, Leclerc has quite a bit of pace in hand, and he goes, 5 laps longer until he pits. So Leclerc gets the overcut done on Sainz here. I know this is a data analysis video, but to me, this just seems like another one of those opportunities that if Ferrari had swapped the cars sooner, Leclerc could have probably made up a little bit more time down the road, or maybe not. I just feel like it's another one of those things where they're throwing away lap time, not prioritizing Leclerc, who's usually faster in the race. But I'll get off that. Now, going back to the race trace, Hamilton does spend quite a bit of time here behind Norris. As soon as he's free of Norris, he pulls away and gets into a little bit of degradation at the end of this stint. But I think we're on for a strong Mercedes race here this weekend. Now, both of the Red Bulls have a pretty quiet and uneventful first stint. Both Verstappen and Perez come through the slower traffic here. Max closes up on Lewis, but it doesn't look like at this point he has the pace outright to pass Lewis. Perez here falling back a little bit, and I'm not sure if he's just holding gap to Max so he doesn't have dirty air, or if that's all the pace he has in hand at this point. Now, let's talk about what happens at this first set of stops here. Now, the first thing I immediately notice is that Max stops, Lewis stops. Max actually undercuts Lewis here by a substantial margin. You can see here Max is within a couple of seconds of Lewis at the stop, and then comes out about 5 seconds ahead of him. So why did that happen? It looks to me like Lewis, ran into a bit of degradation at the end of his stint, and then also it looks like he probably had a bit of a slow outlap, further compounding the gap and undercut that Max had on him at the first stop. Perez also has a really tough stop here. Look how much time he loses relative to everybody else. You can see him, here's his gap to Verstappen here, and then here's his gap to Verstappen after the stop. Now, what I can tell from Perez's stop is that he actually lost quite a bit of time on the in-lap. Similar story to Lewis, just a bit of deg at the end of that stint. And then as the result of that, Perez actually comes out behind traffic. If his in-lap had been on target, he probably would have come out right ahead of the Haas here. But he's lost a lot of time to both Lewis and Max at this stop. Now, the second stint is really what makes this race from a strategy point of view. Now, Leclerc goes a little bit longer on his first stint, pits for new mediums, and this is where Leclerc really shows his pace. I mean, he comes straight through Russell here and makes a huge gap at the end of this stint. Sainz not looking as impressive on this stint at all. The fact that Leclerc undercut here is a true indication that his pace was just better in the race, and I think we all knew that. Now, as far as Russell fighting with Leclerc, it does seem to hurt him a little bit in terms of pace, and then once he falls back into Sainz, he's losing even more lap time driving defensively here. Now, Sainz does struggle to overtake Russell here, and his stint does suffer as a result. Now, Hamilton's second stint here is very strong. Now, one of the main benefits of this stint is that Hamilton's actually able to run in clean air and just kind of do his own thing. He doesn't have to worry about defending, and he can just manage his tires and pace as he sees fit as he closes up the gap slightly to Verstappen here. And Lewis does put a little bit of lap time also into Perez, but the only thing that sucks for this stint is that both Hamilton and Perez lost a bit of time at the stop. Otherwise, they should have been closer to Verstappen. Now, here's where it gets interesting. We're looking at lap 30 to lap 50, and we're focusing on the pit stop sequence at the end of the second stint. Verstappen pits here early on lap 38, forcing this entire sequence. The first thing I notice is that Verstappen actually undercuts Russell. He has a little bit of a slow in-lap, but still manages to get the undercut done. Russell looks like he has a slow out-lap and ends up coming right behind Perez. Realistically, I think they thought Russell would come out ahead of Perez here. Now, if you're not familiar what the undercut is, in short, the undercut is when a trailing car pits for the first time, and then once the leading car pits, it ends up falling behind. Now, there's a couple ways that can happen, and I should probably do a video about general strategy terminology soon. Leave me a comment and let me know if this sounds like a good idea. Now, Perez is at the end of his stint and then pits. He also lets Verstappen through very quickly as they know that they're on different strategies, but this does cost Perez a little bit of track time. Perez also pushes Leclerc back a little bit, which gives Verstappen a clear path to attack Leclerc. Let's talk about Leclerc. Leclerc has had a great second stint. He just gets into a little bit of degradation at the end of the stint. Something happens here at this pit stop. He loses, and then he had a very slow outlap. Well, that is because this is where Leclerc fits the hard tire. But we're going to come back to the hard tire in just a second. Before the pit stop, Leclerc has about 5 to 6 seconds to Russell, and after the stop, it's barely 2 seconds. Now, let's not forget about Sainz. He actually ends up extending this stint about 10 laps longer than everybody else. Now, at the end of the stint, he is losing a bit of lap time as the tires are dropping off, but he's not losing out that much. Yes, relative to Russell, he does lose a bit of track time. Here his gap's about 2 seconds. Here the gap is closer to 8 seconds. But he doesn't lose any position, and he goes longer on that stint, which should give him a little bit more flexibility to push. I mean, he could have stopped 10 laps earlier and fit a hard like Leclerc, but let's talk about that. I mean, you even saw the top 3 drivers in the cooldown room talking about the hard tire. They're like, what? He fit the hard tire? But let's see what we can learn about this hard tire before we rip into Ferrari too heavily, all right? Now, the end of the race is where it gets pretty messy. If Ferrari haven't had it rough enough lately, they make another one of those decisions which gets them quite a bit of flack. Was it wrong to put Leclerc on the hard tire on lap 39? I mean, they had used softs and a hard tire. What do you do? Now, let's have a quick look at the other teams running a hard tire earlier in the race and see what we can learn from them. This is something that strategists are always doing during the race. They're polling other teams, looking at their strategies, seeing how the tires are performing relative to each other. And this is especially important in two-stop races where you have the opportunity to observe multiple tires across different teams and get a good feel for how they're performing. Now, here's the tire usage through the entire race. Up until this point here, several of the drivers have had a go on the hard tire. Got Alonso, Ocon, Zhou, Schumacher, Magnussen, and even Bottas. Now, let's have a quick look at the Alpines and see how their hard tire performed relative to the medium on their one-stop strategy. Now, I've only shown this chart up to lap 40, so we can't really cheat, but this is all the information that Ferrari had available to them at the time. Now, these are again the fuel-corrected lap times. So I've basically taken their lap time and removed the effect of the fuel on the lap time itself in order to determine the pace difference between tire compounds and across stints. Now, I've added a little description here on what exactly I'm doing and how that works. Maybe I'll do a video on that in the future by itself. Fuel corrected, a medium at the start of the race was doing 82 to 82.5 seconds and hit some drop off after 16 laps or so, but there were also in a little bit of traffic, so we need to take that in mind. But this also looks like when they were being overtaken by the race leaders at the start of the race, so just need to take that with a pinch of salt. Now, the hard tire at the start of a stint is about 1 to 1.5 seconds slower, but it doesn't really have any drop off. Basically, the hard tire looks like a medium at the end of its life, and it just keeps doing that, but that's probably not particularly comfortable. Now, as a quick sanity check, let's have a look at what Schumacher thought on the hard tire. I mean, at the start of this stint, Mick is actually getting eaten alive on his hard tire, and that's why he's so slow. Now, there's poor warm-up, he's struggling to defend, all that looks like a complete loss to me. And again, you can see here, the medium tire starts around an 82.5, and then the hard, after it's warmed up, is only an 83 to 84. Realistically, this is not a good race tire. The hard is about as good as a dead medium, but it doesn't have any degradation, but that's still a very slow tire. Now, another thing which hopefully the race engineers, chief engineers, and strategists are all considering is the working range of these tires. Even if you didn't look at the data from the other teams, which is clearly to me saying that you should not consider this hard tire. I mean, it's cold, it's damp, the hard is a bad tire to run. But here's why the Ferrari ended up putting Leclerc onto the hard. It's lap 39, and they need to do 31 laps to get to the end of the race. They can fit a new hard tire, or they can fit scrub softs. The longest stint so far was for Perez with 18 laps on a soft tire. Now, doing a 4-stop strategy is definitely an absolute no, so Ferrari do a 4-stop strategy anyway. Let's go back to the race trace. Now, Leclerc fits the hard tire here, gets absolutely mugged by Verstappen, and then really struggles to defend against Russell while Leclerc's using that hard tire. He stops again for another soft and converts effectively what was a race lead into P6. I mean, even with total hindsight, looking at the soft tire runs at the end of the race, Leclerc could have done a double soft and still beaten Perez. Now, Sainz runs a used soft from lap 47, but he really struggles to make any kind of moves on Russell once he closes the gap, who's on an older medium tire. Now, Lewis, having extended his second stint all the way to lap 51, also fits a new soft at the end of the race, and he comes straight through Sainz and Russell to finish P2. Honestly, it's just another awesome drive by Hamilton. He did a much better version of what Sainz tried to do, and arguably a slower car than what Sainz was driving. Russell finishes just ahead of Sainz and behind Hamilton in P3, which makes our second Mercedes double podium in a row, but honestly, I think this one was pretty well deserved. They were there, they had great pace, and Ferrari screwed themselves once again. We really haven't talked too much about Verstappen this race. He's kind of just been doing his own thing and drove all the way from P10 to P1. I mean, he even had a spin, lost a position to Leclerc, and then overtook him again. Pretty excellent drive, and Max for me had the drive of the day in this race. But there are just a few questions I have left about the race, so let's take a step back and look at it again. I mean, how did Russell lose 2 spots from the race start and Hamilton gain 6? Was Russell just slow today? But before we talk about that, what happened to Checo's race? Looking at the data, his pace was good, but he just seemed to lose time to Max at the stops. A lot of people are saying that they sacrificed Checo again for Max's race, but I'm not sure that's true. Now, despite having very good pace, Checo just seems to lose a lot of time on his pit stops. The first stop for Checo looks like a slow in-lap, and then he gets caught in traffic as a result of that in-lap, which causes him to lose quite a bit of time to his teammate. I think, as we said earlier, the intention was that he was supposed to clear this traffic, and he would have been a lot closer to Max after this stop. Now, in the second stop, he definitely loses about 2 seconds letting Verstappen through and then defending to Russell, but on his outlap, he loses almost 3 seconds compared to Max's outlap. They could have pit Perez here, but it looks like they were actually waiting for Perez to clear Russell, which I think was a good idea. I don't think this was a deliberate plot to sacrifice Checo to save Max. So that gap right there is what we're looking at. Now, here are Checo's fuel-corrected lap times compared to Max. I mean, here, with the exception of traffic, I think he was on pace with Verstappen the entire race, even pretty quick at the end of the final stint here. I think with a bit tighter in and out laps, there's really no reason that Perez shouldn't have been able to finish P2 or even P3. His pace was good and honestly a match for Verstappen. His in and out laps just need a little bit of work, and he was a little bit unlucky. Now, as we discussed earlier, let's talk about Mercedes' race. How did Russell go from P1 to P3 while Hamilton went from P7 to P2? Also, did anybody else notice Toto's grin when Lewis overtook Russell towards the end of the race? Tinfoil hat. Now, realistically, with the exception of the first stint, Lewis benefited massively from having clear air almost the entire race. Now, due to having clean air, Lewis is also able to stretch out his second stint here, which made the final stint on a soft tire with a much better pace advantage very viable as an option. Realistically, George just had to defend too often during this race to make the most out of those stints. Now, I'm not sure if Lewis had necessarily better pace this weekend, but Russell's position relative to other cars just put him at a disadvantage strategically. He was on the back foot and having to defend a lot, which always costs time and it costs tire performance life. And realistically, his hand was forced in a few positions to stop as a result of that. Now, the Mercedes does not have the pace to be able to pull away from the cars they're fighting unless they have a definite tire advantage or a different strategy. That being said, Lewis's final stint on the soft was pretty spicy, and this is another event with him taking home a reasonable chunk of points. And while we're on the topic of points, here's the season so far. Red Bull are running away with this championship. Ferrari dropping away and Mercedes steadily climbing. I would not be surprised to see Mercedes overtake Ferrari in the championship soon. And for me, it's honestly anyone's guess who's going to finish fourth out of Alpine and McLaren. Now, if you enjoyed this kind of race analysis, I've left a playlist here with some of my other race breakdowns. Be sure to check them out, and I'll see you guys after the summer break.